Welcome to Jewish Midlife. Hi, I'm Devara Krasniansky, and in this episode, we delve into the critical topic of difficult marriages and domestic violence. I once again had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Shana Frydman, the esteemed CEO of Shalom Task Force, who shares her extensive knowledge and experience in supporting individuals in challenging marriages, fostering healthy relationships, and providing guidance for those in abusive situations. We explore the nuances of domestic violence, the importance of understanding the dynamics of power and control, and how these differ from a difficult marriage, and whether that distinction really makes a difference. Midlife often prompts reflection, especially as our children grow and life dynamics shift, and it's during this time that many women assess the state of the marriage and then consider their options if their relationships are difficult or abusive. Dr. Frydman emphasizes the possibilities for moving forward, focusing on how to navigate these situations rather than only advocating for dissolving the marriage. She discusses the possibilities women can consider and how friends, family, and the community can offer support. Join us for this vital conversation that aims to educate, empower, and promote safety and well-being for these women. This is an important episode. So, Shana, I'm really excited to be talking about this important topic. And at the same time, it's a little bit of trepidation because it's an important topic. And so let's go into it. But first, just talk about what you do.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here again, Devora. It's always a pleasure to just have a conversation and share some of our thoughts together and learn and grow together. So I am honored to be the CEO of Shalom Task Force, which is really the Jewish response to domestic violence. And we provide services to the Jewish community, the Frum community around prevention, intervention, and helping foster healthy relationships. So we have a hotline, chat line for people who want to just figure out what's going on in their relationship and just get not judgmental feedback and help and safety and referrals. And then we have legal services to help people navigate and think about if they choose to pursue some legal action to see what that is, both in civil court, but also based in, just to think that through. And then we have our education programming, which is why I'm here, because we really would rather do prevention work and just increase awareness around the issues of healthy relationships and domestic violence in our community. So we try to meet with people and be out there to increase that awareness in our community together.
Right. And I loved our conversations that we talked in that space of early marriage or even engagement or predating. But now we're talking about a little bit different. We're talking about midlife. And if someone was in a marriage that is troublesome, so I want to talk about that and what that could look like, what someone has many years left of their life. What can we talk about as far as challenging marriages get worse after the empty nest? Can we unpack a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean that's a big topic, just like marriage in general and like what are the trends in marriage. So, a marriage that someone's struggling with domestic violence, intimate partner violence is different than like high conflict or unhealthy marriage. And I think we just want to make the distinction. And both are important to address, as are healthy relationships. We should address that because we want to support them, right? We want to support people in healthy relationships. And any of us who have been blessed to be in long-term marriages know that there's ups and downs and that's normal. And if we're here talking to people who are midlife and they've been married for 20, 30, 40 years, no matters what midlife means to people, I think anyone, if they're honest, is going to say that there are times that marriage felt stronger and easier, and there are times where there were struggles, and that in itself is not domestic violence. And so when we talk about domestic violence, we're really talking about relationships that are defined as and marked with a dynamic of power and control, where one party is trying to control the other party through, and there's a pattern of that behavior and there's a level of fear. So it's not kind of like the couples that just have this banter back and forth, which many of us don't like, but that in itself is not controlling. We're really talking about people who may live on eggshells around the other person, and the other person uses all different forms, times of abuse. And though we usually often will talk about early marriage and dating and the red flags, but we see it, it doesn't go away. It usually gets worse in the marriage, right? It's not going to go away. And so you see it in all ages. Shalom Task Force, we have clients who come in their 60s and their 70s. I personally have counseled women in our community who have been married for 30 years, where, they are finally finding the space to talk about their experience and to see how can they be empowered to have a different life going forward? It doesn't mean divorce always. It really doesn't. It just mean that they want to just look at what's going on and see. And there's also safety concerns. So I just said a lot, and we could start unpacking that. But like, so domestic violence, let's start with the idea is that domestic violence isn't just a challenging time in a marriage or just an unhealthy space. It's domestic violence is a marriage that's defined by this dynamic of power and control. And it could take many forms. So we're not only talking about physical violence. And Devorah, whenever I speak nowadays or talk to anyone, and I don't know if this is new, but this is like, if I could get if every time I leave a speaking engagement or any sort of workshop and everybody walks away knowing that domestic violence is not only physical, I consider that success.
So let's talk about the domestic violence wheel that we've spoken about in the past. I think there's so many other aspects.
Yeah.
And then there's the firm one on top of everything else. So let's talk about that.
So I think the domestic violence wheel, which is really presented as like the middle of it looks like power and control. So all the behaviors of the person who's causing harm.
Let's talk about when we're talking about power and control. What does that control mean?
Right. Takes away the other person's self-determination. And that is done in many, many different ways, right? So it's not only the overt or covert threat of physical or sexual violence, but it may be verbal abuse, name calling, demeaning behavior, gaslighting, making the person think they're crazy, isolating the person from their resources and their friends so they don't have any other support system. It might be financial abuse, which is not about budgeting. It's about one person having access and controlling all the finances without a voice, without any conversation. It might be using Torah sources and like religion in a way to control the other person. So it's not about having some kind of discussion about how machmir you're going to be on something or how you're going to observe some mitzvah. It's really like you're going to do it this way, either more strict or less strict without any sort of permission to discuss. So it's using all these different types of and forms of abuse. We see technological abuse where the person stalks the person through our cell phones now, or will cyber abuse a person or threaten them through use of technology. So it's any of these different forms of abuse to control the other person. And there's this understanding that they don't have their own voice or self-determination. And what happens, and I'll say that when we meet with people who have been in longer term marriages, which they are, if you want to call them midlife, is that very often because of this dynamic, the person who comes to us, the survivor, we would call them, doesn't have a real sense of self because for many years they weren't allowed to make decisions. I always kind of thought about when I used to counsel women and they would present to me as 45, 55, people have been married for 20, 25, 30 years. And I felt like I was sitting with an adolescent where they didn't know how to think things through. And they didn't know what they wanted. And my understanding of that is it's almost a trauma response. They've been in these relationships since they were very young, often. They've never been able to grow themselves in that way. And they've never been trusted with any real decisions, and they're always being second guessed and demeaned for their decisions. So when you're asking them what they're interested in exploring, or you're trying to explore things with them, they don't even have that space anymore, and you have to help them become more empowered. We used to do it even in simple things like what kind of tea they would want, or what kind of activities they would like that don't have to be big lifestyle changes, but just what can they assert in their lives around what they like are they allowed to say what they want for dinner? It sounds almost silly to us, but are they allowed to assert their own desires and their own needs? Can they take 15 minutes to go for a walk, not only under the quote unquote self-care, but are they allowed to take time for themselves and assert a need of theirs? And when you meet someone who's been in a long-term relationship that's marred with intimate partner violence dynamic, they often can't. And it's because they're not trusted to make decisions. And that's really a big part of it. It's their sense of self is really devastated. And then I think you said before is you kind of impose on top of that circle, that model, this idea of our frum community, where are there it's kind of a universal thing, but also are there certain dynamics that exist there that don't exist other places? How is the community used to maintain and obtain that control, right? Is there a community, or is some sort of our religious practice used, or just how do we see our observance, our practice, and our culture as ways that might maintain someone and keep someone in this relationship longer term, or not, or feeling less control over their own lives? Does that resonate when I'm
Yeah, so I think some of them we're talking about is stigma and shanda and all those.
Stigma and shanda, So the idea of like how much does the community pressure someone to stay in a relationship, and what would it be like for someone to make a decision to no longer be there, and where would their place in the community be, and can they imagine not being married, and would they still be part of their community of origin? And I'm always very careful for people to recognize that when people are looking to, let's say, leave an unsafe relationship, we shouldn't force them to also leave the community. Like they should have space in our community. Let's not conflate the two issues. Leaving an unsafe relationship does not mean you should have to leave your from community. You should still have a space in our community. How do we do that? How do we make sure that people feel still that they have a community of origin and they're still embraced by things that they love? That's not what they're trying to leave. They're trying to stay safe.
So I'm just wondering, because we talked about a lot of what this dynamic could look like, or shouldn't look like, but might be looking like. Does it necessarily get better or worse with age or with time? Like when the kids start leaving the house, is that, and there's
So I don't want to say, I don't know that we have any
distraction?
studies of when it gets better or when it gets worse, but I wouldn't say that people should believe it's going to get better. Like it's not because of stress of children that people are abusive, right? Like it's not because of the stress of tuition payments that people are abusive. They're abusive because they're choosing to assert power and control over the other person. There might be a lot of other dynamics there and like factors, but that's a choice. So what we do see is that people come forward often, and it seems almost cliche, but they often come forward when their youngest child gets married because there's a lot of pressure around shidduchim, and what would it mean to your children if they came from quote unquote a divorced home, and it would be less than. So even though we will say to people that children who have two safe parents who could both be involved in their lives and that's safe, even in separate households, are much better off than children who are witnessing domestic violence, right? We would say that, but I understand the pressure. The pressure is very, very real around shidduchim. And so we will often see clients come forward shortly after the Sheva Brachot of their last child to get married, saying, okay, I want to explore what this would mean. It doesn't mean they're getting divorced. I want to explore what this would mean. I need to figure out my safety. I'm now alone at home with someone who's been historically abusive to me, either physically or non-physically, and I'm more scared. And there's no distractions, because sometimes children do act as a distraction and a buffer in the space, right? Like a third party in the home might diffuse some of that energy. And not that that's the children's role, but there's a reality. And now I'm home alone. And what will that feel like? How safe will I be? And like, how are we going to navigate this if there's no one else around? So we do see people. So I don't know that there's any studies, and I don't know that maybe someone listening will send me them. But let's say, oh, when it gets older or the kids are out, it gets more dangerous. But I will say that there's certainly factors there. I think the shidduch piece is huge to people. It's really a very significant factor of like, how can I leave if my children need us to be married for them to get married? And then we'll explore what that means. So we do see that. I mean, yeah.
So, but I've also heard a recent story is that someone chose to stay because she knew she wouldn't be able to pay for the wedding.
Yeah.
For her kid's wedding. So it's not only the shidduchim, it's if she
Like,
leaves and she's going to have all these expenses, so she
right.
figured she can
And like
keep them
setting
for
their
2
kids up
years.
right. Like setting our kids, like set the kids up right. I don't want to make it worse for them. I've tolerated this for enough years. Like I could handle it in some way. I know how to live with this. I want to make sure my children are set up. And then I'll explore what this can mean to me. And it's still really hard after that. Like it's not like, oh, then you have to figure out what it means. Like, what does this mean? What do I want? What are my possible next steps? How will it play out? And then there's the safety issues, there's health issues, like someone's getting older, and midlife means something so different. I mean, I guess for some people 45 is midlife, right? And then for some people it might be 65 or 7. I don't know. There's people might be in different spaces. What are the economic issues? What would it mean not to be together? My social issues, like who will I be with, and what would my Shabbos look like, and who will I socialize with if I'm no longer part of this couple group? So there's a lot of things to consider, and they have to be considered. They have to really be explored and supported.
But the same woman I was talking to, she was saying that she wants to live before she dies.
That's
And
powerful.
that stunned me. That's why I reached out to you. Like, what can we help people recognize and know and think about, or should they just call Shalom Task Force because you have helped them think it through?
I mean, I think it's both. I mean, nobody's gonna be able to do it for someone else, but like a statement like that, I want to live before I die. Like, what does live? I mean, what would live mean to her? Like, what hasn't she been able to do? right? What has been restricted to her? What does she feel that she hasn't been able to explore in her own life? And it could be a whole range of things. It could be friendships. It might be that one of the dynamics of the relationship is that he isolated her. And we're using he because that's the vast majority, but it could be the other way.
Well, we're also
But
talking to women in this conversation, so
okay, there we go, talking to
that's
women.
our
Okay.
intended audience. So yes, we could.
Okay. So, you know what I'm saying? But maybe part of the dynamic is he isolated her and didn't really allow her to have like real women friends and like be involved in the community in that way. Or maybe she was isolated from her own family and she hasn't been as involved in her parents' care or her siblings. And maybe for her, that means living her life, like having more meaningful and robust relationships outside the marriage with other people and being involved in community or maybe involved in learning. You don't know, people want to explore different parts of their lives, and is this relationship restricting that in a way that's a dynamic of control? What would it mean? What would it mean to live before you die? What would it mean? Does it mean that you never had the opportunity to have a career, and is there something you want to go explore a career and then have access to travel? There's so many, or access to be a different type of grandparent, or and is this relationship restricting that through control? And then how would you pursue that? Like what's a safe way to pursue that? What's a strategic and smart way to pursue that? And it means something different for everybody. It may mean dissolving a relationship and leaving a relationship. It may mean figuring out a different way of living within that relationship that's still but obtaining some safety. And that's a very individual journey, and people are welcome to call the hotline to explore it. And I'd say that besides the hotline, they should see a mental health practitioner who knows a bit about this and can really help them think this through in a safe way, and support it, like support that experience for them and figure out what they want to do.
Something else someone mentioned is that with the hormones that come with midlife,
Yeah.
that she may be, and this is what someone was saying, that someone told her that it's just your hormones. He's really not so bad. You're just exaggerating because it's your hormones. You were okay for all these 20 years or so. And maybe it is her hormones, and maybe it's both.
First of all, when people say, oh, you were okay for the last 20, 25 years, they have no idea. Nobody knows. I mean, nobody else lived in that relationship. So she might have managed for the last 20, 25 years, right? She was busy raising children and holding down maybe a job and dealing with everything else that it takes to raise a family. And she managed around that, right? But to say, oh, you were fine, we have no idea. We have no idea, right? I spoke to a Rav recently who told me, very supportive Rav, who I respect a lot and is very helpful to me. But he shared that a family came to him after there was a physical assault, and he called the husband and said, you have to stop. And she hasn't heard from them anymore. So he thinks things went in the right direction. And I'm like, why would that be the assumption? Like what they just, it could be that he felt accountable to his Rav. It could be he felt accountable to his Rav, and that was a way to hold the person who was causing harm accountable. And maybe he did change his physical behavior, or it could be they're just not telling you. And so when people say to people, oh, you've been married for 25 years, like, why are you stirring up now? You have no idea. Let's err on the side of just not being judgmental because we're not in there and we don't know. And the comment about hormones, okay, I don't know. I'm not a medical physician, but I'd say, is there a component that someone might be more sensitive to things? I guess it's possible, but I think that's a way of really minimizing someone's experience, honestly. I think people could still speak rationally and look at their lives and get help during physiological changes in their lives. And I think we have to be, again, careful not to judge and jump to assumptions about people. I don't know. I wouldn't say that.
And the flip of the hormones, yes, some people can really get, without regulating their hormones, they could really get into a whole different almost a whole different personality. And I don't think that he again, we're talking to women here. I don't think he's only responding to the hormones. It's probably from way before that. And if he was a kind, compassionate person,
caring, supportive spouse, so then they would go and get the medical care they need, right? And you get the consultations they need so that things could be regulated and that they get what they deserve. I mean, people need to take care of their medical health, and so that they could and that's not something to be made fun of or used as something to abuse someone or like it should just be okay. So it's a new reality. The same way, I mean, we have a friend who's diabetic. You wouldn't make fun of them for using insulin, right? You would help them manage their lives through getting insulin. I mean, any kind of medical issue, and it shouldn't be disregarded or minimized,
Right.
But to think that someone's
libido
abusive,
also, like someone's lowered libido, It's
Yes,
something to work through together. It's not like you
together.
must.
Right. Something to work through together. And there's a reality to that. And it's not only women, there's also men. Right. There's a reality to that. And that's part of living with someone and supporting someone in a long-term relationship. You go through lots of changes in your life.
I want to talk to the idea of the Rev for a second, or also the idea of couples therapy. When we're
Yeah.
talking about domestic violence, let's talk about a little bit about couples therapy versus individual therapy, and which is warranted, and how does that all work?
The feeling, the kind of research in the world of domestic violence, that there's a presence of this dynamic of power and control. We do not recommend couples therapy. So if that's the history, if that's what we know about the couple, our recommendation is for people to go to individual treatment, be evaluated for what's going on. And if the professionals involved think that it would be safe and helpful for them to be together, then perhaps it makes some sense. But people should be working individually. That's different than what we would say with couples who are just having like a hard time and high conflict, but there isn't a sense of power and control in the dynamic. And if you're not sure where you are in that continuum, like you're kind of, I'm not really sure, then err on the side of going to individual. And then after an assessment, an appropriate assessment, then perhaps it would make sense to do some couples work. The idea behind that is couples work is counterindicated because it could be almost dangerous. And like couples work is around both people having equal responsibility for the behavior, for the dynamic. It could also, you're supposed to be vulnerable and share things. And if one of the parties there is abusive and controlling, it could make it worse. And the person who's being hurt should not be taking responsibility for the person who's hurting, like their behavior. And that's what couples work would entail is the accountability and shared responsibility for the dynamic. So we recommend people go to individual to really assess it. And then if deemed by and assessed by people who are familiar with dynamic, then could consider it. But that's our recommendation. That's the recommendation of the field.
So what I'm also hearing then is that if someone says, if you want, reach out to your Rev individually, and he
Yeah.
says, I think you should come in as a couple, you could push back and say, I really want to talk to you myself first.
Yes. Yes. And yes, that a Rav
And
could be a
also
great place
insist
to
that
start.
whatever I'm sharing should not be brought up to my
Should not be
husband.
brought up. And when we do training with Rabbanim and with other community leaders, we're very clear that what's shared is confidential, and we want to warn people that if they share with the other party, they don't know what kind of harm or risk they're creating. And so should never share information without consent. There should never be sharing of information without consent. And that their responsibility is not to do that. And now if they both choose to come in, I think it could be done very strategically and with a lot of intention, and get support. Rabbanim, we call Rabbanim all the time for support around things, and I really appreciate Rabbanim call and ask for support around issues they see, because we're really partners in helping people find safety and helping people find health. That's what we want to be doing together.
Right. So if we're talking to, let's say, again, the women here,
Mm-hmm.
we could, as the woman who's coming to the Rev, to say, to like stress throughout the conversation, or in the beginning and middle end of the conversation, is like, what I'm sharing, I do not want you to go to my husband. Don't try
Right.
to figure it out.
Don't try to fix it for me. Don't pull them aside and say, stop doing something. I'm here just for support. I'm here for, and I think also people that go to Rabbanim, and they have to be clear what they're asking their Rav to do. Like if they're there for support, are they asking a Shaila? Do they feel they have great insight that they could help them with? Like to be very clear, what are you asking from the Rav? And then to be very clear, like I'm sharing this with you. It's confidential. Please don't share it. It might put me at risk. I will let you know at some point if I'm comfortable with you sharing it. But to say that, because some Rabbanim really from the greatest place, not only Rabbanim, anyone. I think people would do things out of the beautiful intentions, but don't really know, may not be as familiar what could happen, and it's not their role, right? You're not asking them to be a peacemaker. You're asking for support. You're asking for a shaila. And to be clear about what you're asking. But Rabbanim could be a wonderful support to a lot of people.
I think Rabbanim have a really a support. At the same time, some are very well intentioned, and even family friends or whatever, they're well intentioned, and they think that they have the magic way of making all this end for somebody.
Right. And to just make it better. And they really want to make it better. They really do.
They
People
do.
want to,
They have the best
family, friends, they want to make it better. They care, they love you. And when you're talking to friends, I think you would say the same kind of thing. I'm sharing this with you because I want support. I don't want to be alone with it. but please don't tell anyone else, and please don't call my husband. That wouldn't be helpful right now. Be clear about those boundaries. It's not helpful.
I think the person in the situation probably knows best about what's safe.
Right. And so we often talk about it being very client centered, and all of our work is client centered. And that's some of the hardest part of being a supporter of someone, is that you have to go according to their pace. So even if our instinct is to XYZ and jump ahead and do something, unless someone's in imminent danger or going to hurt someone imminently, where, besides for mandated reporting, you just, there's like that level of risk. Um, they really, we really have to follow what that person's telling you they want you to do. So if that's just to listen, if that's to sit and help them make a phone call, if that's to help them photocopy all their papers and keep them somewhere else, so they needed to leave, they had access, to really think about what they need, and be mindful about who you talk to about it, and aware. And I'll say that around, I'd say, I haven't looked at numbers, but 20 to 30% of our phone calls to our hotline, helpline, chat line are from third parties, meaning not the actual survivor victim themselves, but from community members who care deeply for people and who just want to know what they're supposed to do to be a good sister, parent, brother, teacher. They're not sure what to do. And that's a good place, right? If someone comes to you, that's confidential, it's de-identified, nobody will know who you're talking about. And it's a good place to say, like, what do I do now? And to get some pointers about, like, how can I safely help my friend, daughter, sister, student, whoever it is in your life.
So I think that if we
It's not
start
breaking confidence.
controlling them and telling them this is what you must do, you're just kind of another person controlling in their life and
Yeah.
keeping them small again.
And that's a big part of what we talk about, is that you want to not mimic the dynamic of power and control.
Even though that's all that they may be familiar with, and they kind of
They're
defer it a
kind of
little
asking
bit.
for it a little bit because that's what they're used to. They're not, again, we're going back to this idea, it's people who have not had the opportunity or given the respect to be able to make decisions in their lives will often ask us to make decisions for them, but we can't. It needs to be their decisions.
And the other thing that I think when we always spoke about domestic violence in the past is that usually people don't walk out at the first time, oh, I really should leave. And it could be years. And this is part of the
Right. And I
dynamic.
mean, people use the mushel, and I do relate to it as a frog in the boiling water, where they just turn it up slowly, slowly until it's really boiling. And why does the frog stay in there? So, like, in many ways, domestic violence situations, I mean, and we talk about this a little bit more in the earlier stages, but throughout, is like very few people we know that we've seen go from having a loving, kind, supportive relationship to physical violence, right? I mean, unless there's like a traumatic brain injury, and that's kind of a different thing. Like, that's not what's going on. It usually starts with the coercive control, non-physical abuse, emotional, the financial, the isolation, the jealousy, the possessiveness, right? And we see those like sprinkled throughout, and then it gets bigger and bigger. And sometimes there's almost no physical violence. Like, there'll be like one or two incidents, but there's an understanding that there's a threat of physical or sexual violence. But people are in it for a very long time, and it's really hard to imagine another option, another life. And I was talking about this last week with a group, and we're talking about like divorce and how difficult it is. And I don't think anyone should ever minimize that. It's really, really hard. And something I often think about is being in a domestic violence relationship is really hard. Getting divorced is very hard. I often think about this, and I got this from my clients, is that being divorced is very hard with some hope that there might be something different. Where when you're in a domestic violence situation, there most probably won't be any changes. The dynamic will be like that. Might look different at different ages. It might express itself, but it's going to be a controlling relationship. And then what can you manage? Like, and not everybody is going to leave the relationship, but what other things are possible in your life? And that's really individual, and no one could tell someone else what to do. Like, it's exceptionally personal. And everybody has different resources. Everybody has different strengths. Everybody has different considerations. And to be respectful of that, and do not judge people's decisions in either direction, right? Like, you'll hear people say, how can someone stay in that? How can someone leave? It's very, very personal.
Don't judge yourself for having stayed so long. I
Yourself,
think
right?
that's a
Don't
very
judge
key
yourself.
piece.
Don't, I mean, get support, gratefully. The community has a lot more support than it used to. I mean, there are services all over. We have lists and lists of vetted services all over the country. Most of them are very low fee or no fee, for people who get support and have the opportunity they deserve to think these things through, with no obligation to leave or make big choices, just a place to be not judged through the experience of processing it.
So I'm wondering then, could someone gain the skills and become more empowered, or is that the relationship, if it's 20 years, there's just no way to make any changes?
I can't say. I mean, are there ways that relationships can shift in their dynamic? I don't want to say no to anything. There's a lot of steps before then. I mean, if it's domestic violence, the other person, we're not talking about learning to be better spouses to each other, or people who have, there isn't a fear, there isn't power and control. For someone to change their behavior, the person who causes the harm, there has to be, like, I always think about like the teshuva process, right? Like there has to be like true charata, right? One day I'm gonna like write this out. Like, there's a true charata, right? There has to be real remorse. There has to be kabbalah atid. Like you have to really not do it in the future, right? There has to be a real accountability. It isn't like I'm sorry, and then you just do it in a lighter version, or you don't do it for a few weeks. Like there has to be a real sense of accountability and responsibility and change, and then you have to change, right? You're presented, isn't that what we talk about in Shuv? Like you're presented in the same situation and you don't behave in the same way, and there has to be a pattern of behaving in the right way. And so, like as a mental health practitioner, as someone who strives to be a Torah Jew, like I have to believe there's opportunity for change, but the change is on the person who's behaving in that way. And how do you get there? And I think that we probably should have more services to help support people who are behaving this way. We don't have a ton of services for them, not for the sake of the marriage, for the sake of that person, so that they behave in a way that's better. And maybe that would help in the marriage. My long answer to that short question is I'm sure there are ways that people could shift the dynamics in relationships. I don't know them. And I would say that the party that causes harm has to take real responsibility. And very often, or most often, or almost always, if I could say it that way, the person causing harm does not see themselves as someone causing harm. They most often see their behavior is appropriate and allowed. They think they're almost allowed to, like it's part of their privilege to behave in this way. And those are very hard dynamics to work through if you're going to be accountable and responsible for yourself.
And usually it's to their advantage. I mean, to their benefit.
Yeah.
They have things exactly the way they want it.
Yeah.
And it's 30, 40 years entrenched.
Yeah, it's entrenched.
And in their 20s, it's only,
it's early, right. I mean, they're entrenched and it's worked for them.
And they always say that, older people are harder to make changes. So I'm not that it's impossible, because I've seen
it's impossible, but I mean, the other question is like, is it possible for the person who's being hurt to find a different life? And like, I think it is. I mean, I'm not sure what a different life has to look like, but can they find new interests? Can they have new relationships with other women and find joy? Can they get involved in new chesed activities? Are they able to pursue different careers? Like, and it matters how controlling the other person is. And perhaps some of that could become a little less when there's no children at home and there's a little bit more time. But people can explore different chapters in their lives. And it's up to them to figure out how that fits. And it's up to us, us both, as mental health practitioners, as community people, but also just as community members, right, is to giving space for people to explore next chapters, and embracing them.
I think that embracing piece is very important, because people who were trapped, let's just say, or kept smaller, and as they try to get out,
like that, kept smaller, yeah.
And as they try to get out, they may step out in ways that are not necessarily socially perfect. And so let's give them the space and the support to step out and become who they want to become. And I think that some people may do it in awkward ways to start. And I think that being part of the community to help them, and just in general, by the time we get to midlife, we know that everyone has stuff, and we should just be embracing of everyone. And we may not have so much time for everybody but try to recognize that people are coming from someplace.
Right. And we all want that for ourselves. Even, we all want that. We all want to be embraced. We all want to be allowed to have second chances and pursue new things and have new interests, and to have grace for other people. We don't know what people's experience. We have absolutely no idea what people's life experiences are. Behind closed doors can look very different for people.
We were a whole time assuming that people were married for a long time, but some people can get into a second marriage in midlife too. Mm-hmm. And it's different. And I think that the midlife altogether is like, I don't necessarily want to live the way I was living before. People
Right.
have to get to that point in their life and say, hey, wait a second. They take stock in midlife. Like this, whatever I did till now, I don't want to continue that part and that part and that part. Whether it's in general, the marriage or whatever it is, I don't want to continue the way it was, or the work that I was doing. And I think that that's what comes up in midlife. So whatever it is, we're talking now about specifically domestic violence, interpersonal, intercouple, not even talking about children or whatever. That's a whole different
Right.
domestic
Whole
violence.
different game, right?
So that's a whole different thing. But that whole taking stock happens in midlife, and it's like, wait a second, how did I get here?
I get here, and what do I like about my life, and what works for me, and what are things I don't like, and how can I make some changes that are feasible? And that's really not only domestic violence, just life. What can I allow myself to do, and how do I make it happen? And we all know people in our lives. I mean, this is not TV related, but that have these incredible 40s through 60s where they like find new careers, or they become artists, or they seem to just like take on a different life. And it's beautiful. Like there doesn't you can take stock, you can change. And there are people who do it in much more subtle ways, where they pursue exercise in a different way, or pursue learning in a different way. And to give, to give space for that as well. And that's even in healthy relationships, right? There's adjustments. Listen, there's adjustments. I'm in the stage where kids go away to camp, and I'll say our friends and I, we all joke, like there's adjustments when you're home alone, right? Or you have less kids at home, where like there are adjustments, and like how can you use that time, not only in the relationship but for yourself? Like what do I give myself permission to when I don't have any, I have less kids in my house, or no kids in my house for a few weeks? Like do I get to, do something else for myself? And it could be, again, it gives opportunity for space to rethink things. um,
I think that's what happens in midlife is we were so busy, maybe for some people that were so busy with getting the career
yeah,
or working on the kids that they themselves were
it's
backwards.
so
Now all of
busy.
a
I
sudden
mean,
it's like, I want some space for myself, or I need some more time for myself, for my exercise or whatever it is, self-care as a want or a need. But I think that physically,
yeah,
some of us really, really need to do that exercise. The doctors
yeah,
are saying so,
absolutely.
not, and we need that time. And if we're
Yep,
not allowed that time, what are we going to do about that? And all these other things, that these questions that come up, and I think that it's worth knowing about the resources that are available. If what you're coming up for you is a
yep,
domestic violence situation or something yucky about the marriage that you're not even sure what it is because it's been like this for so long. So we're really grateful. The whole community is grateful for someone like the Shalom Task Force, yourself, and mental health practitioners in that space, the Rabbanim in that space. I think it's really, I want to stress that in that space, that really know how to deal with it, know what's really going on, and not just poo-pooing it as something else that it's really not.
right. Yeah, I appreciate that. And to give permission for that. That's okay. It's okay to take stock. I mean, we talk about cheshbon nefesh a lot in our, in our avoda, like taking stock and allowing for that as a very positive part of like human development and our relationship with both Hashem and with other people and ourselves, right? It's how we're able to move forward and grow. And for people who in that space come upon things that they're afraid of, or they realize that the dynamic is scary to them, to know that there are resources. There are resources available, and the resources won't tell them what to do. And I want to reiterate that. I always want people to know that when you call Shalom Task Force, we have no caller ID. We actually pay extra for software that doesn't let us have caller ID. We have to do a lot of work around that. It's a whole story in itself, but because we don't want people to think that, we want people to know that so they could call with confidence that it's their opportunity to talk, and nobody knows who they are, and we won't tell anybody ever what to do. We don't tell people what to do because it's really everybody else. Everybody has to have their own journey through that and see what they want to do and explore their options. And that's our policy. It's how we train everybody. That they're, and then they hopefully get very good information, psychoeducation, and just a space to be heard. Because I think a lot of times there's so much noise in our lives. It's so busy. It is so busy that like even finding that time to hear yourself say something out loud, um, in itself is a really good practice to tell someone what's going on. And that person doesn't have to know you. The person doesn't have to, is never going to follow up with you in a way that's positive. They're not going to, it's a space to hear yourself say something out loud and then maybe explore it. And there's support for that.
Yes, I have two questions, and then so I do want to talk about how people can reach the chat line, hotline, phone
Okay.
line. But I think that people are throwing around the words like domestic violence or domestic abuse a lot. And it doesn't really matter if someone feels uncomfortable, or does it really matter what we call it?
It only matters in the sense of like, it doesn't matter if we're calling because we're not going to diagnose what your experience is, and it's just a place to get support. So if you think you're in an unhealthy relationship versus a domestic violence situation, it doesn't really matter in that sense. We'll just support you in hearing yourself talk, giving you support, psychoeducation. That's fine. Where does it matter? It matters with intervention, like we said before. If it's domestic violence, you shouldn't be going to a couples counselor. If it's a relationship that is on the space of unhealthy, then maybe couples work would make sense. But then go to a mental health practitioner and get it looked at, like look at it together and figure it out. So that's where it matters. I'd say it matters in a younger crowd where where safety concerns matter. So like if we're talking about not safe situations, then there's interventions and legal remedies that are important for people who are not safe. And that's something to explore. But like that, when you're talking about child custody and for populations that's what they're dealing with, children should have access to both children and both parents when it's safe, but they have to be looked at safety, so there are places where it matters, and there are places where like just get support, like reach out, get support. Nobody's going to diagnose your situation for you on a hotline. And then, if you're interested in pursuing it more, meet with people who understand these dynamics, who've worked a lot with couples, who've worked a lot with domestic violence, who understand trauma, who will be able to help you figure out like what's going on and give words to your experience. So it kind of matters, but it doesn't matter for calling, like you could just call and get support, and we don't have to call it domestic violence. Yeah, for some people, it's very empowering to have that language when they look at the Jewish power and control wheel, and they're able to identify behaviors that and abusive tactics that were used against them, and to know that they're not the only Jewish survivor of domestic violence, and to see themselves as not alone. That can be very empowering, and like giving language to someone's experience could be very healing to some people. And for some people, that's just not necessary, and they just need a place to, as you said, voice their experience and get support. So,
Okay, so Shalom Task Force, what's the website and how can people reach you?
website is shalomtaskforce.org. And you get in touch with 888-883-2323. That's both the phone call, but you can also WhatsApp it or text it. Monday through Thursday, it's 9 a.m. 10 p.m. And then when Fridays and Sundays, it's 9 to 12. And it's not a 24/7 hotline. If someone is unsafe in that way, they could call the local hotline, or if they need to, they should reach out for police, Atzala, if they're in that level of danger. But otherwise, we're here to be helpful. There's also online, you go to our website. Yeah.
So you mentioned that from Domestic Violence Wheels, you have resources on your website.
On our website, there's a tab that says resources, and everything's there. You also have
on your website is that if someone needs to, they can just shut it down immediately.
They should shut it down right away. It says exit site. It goes right to weather, Google, matters what we're up to. And it also shows you how to, there's a whole, before you even go into our website, it clearly says what digital safety, make sure nobody's tracking you, to give you information. So that's another piece of this that people should be able to keep that private. And if you're listening to this and you work for, like you are very involved in any of our community institutions, we have some really beautiful signage for people that's very positive about healthy relationships. If you feel like, it would be helpful to your community to know more about this, they've been very well received by people. So that's available to people. And we go into communities to do lectures, workshops for all different ages. So.
And last question, when someone does call rather than text, how much time could they expect to have a conversation? What do they expect from a conversation?
So it's a great question, because people call for 3 minutes, people call for 45. It just really matters what you'll never be asked your name, where you're from. Like, do not.
So it's not a 3-minute conversation. You will get the time. You'll get a real ear.
You'll get the time you need. Yes, you'll get the time you need. They will not rush you through. We usually have at least 2 people answering at a time. So for the most part, you will get someone. There are times that it gets crazy busy, and I'll say, please call back in a few minutes, because like we just don't have enough staff. But typically, it's right away. You will not be asked your name or where you're from. You might be asked where you're from if you're asking for a referral, and we have to look up a referral that's local to you. But other than that, we don't do a lot of demographic collection unless you offer it. And it's really like often it'll be just a conversation of like what brought you to call today, and then just really active listening, validating your experience, and then, if appropriate, do some safety planning, thinking about how to deal with safety issues, if appropriate, a referral if that's what someone's looking for. And that's really what it's like.
It's much more than just active listening, where everyone is learning how to do active listening.
Oh,
It's really knowledgeable active listening.
knowledgeable, trained people who know about domestic violence, who could probably lecture me on domestic violence. They're really exceptional. But it's a place to learn about that and to learn about your experience and to voice your experience in a completely non-judgmental, de-identified, anonymous, confidential space.
It's just such a powerful, important conversation, Shana. Thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure to hang out, converse.
I love hearing what you're up to. They're doing so many new things these days. So good for Shalom Task Force, good for the community.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me in another fascinating conversation about midlife. If you'd like to reach me, Devora Krasniansky, to talk about your midlife or anything else, you can reach me at jewishmidlife@gmail.com, and follow us at Jewish Midlife on Instagram and Facebook, and join us in our conversations on our Facebook group at facebook.com/group/Jewish Women Talk About Midlife.